All right, so now we're on to our next goal, which is the involvement and influence of the U.S. So we're no longer just talking about the economic interest. We're talking about the boots to the ground. How did they actually get out there and get involved in various theaters in the world as a U.S. imperial power? All right, so first thing I'm going to talk about is the Cuban Rebellion. So take a look at that map down at the bottom left. You'll notice that Miami and Havana are very, very close. You're talking about 90 miles in some places when you get down to the Florida Keys. Now, Spain had controlled Cuba since the 1500s, so we're talking about the time of Columbus here, how long Spain's controlled this little area of land. Now, Cuba had tried for decades to get independence from Spain. Now, there was very little success with that, but Spain, over time, since the 1500s, has been losing power gradually and almost completely by this time. So each rebellion had to be put down until late 1890s. So you're talking about rebellion after rebellion and a weakening Spanish empire the whole time we're going through this. And here's a quick political cartoon of the time period. This would have been a cartoon used to justify U.S. intervention in Cuba, because basically what the Americans' position was that Spanish was basically being a poor ruler. They weren't taking care of the property, and as a result, there was a lot of anarchy taking place, and that wouldn't be such a big issue. But the problem is Cuba is very, very close to Florida, so we're from our perspective, we're looking at this going, well, because of mismanagement by Spain. Now we got to deal with anarchy, a grand total of less than 100 miles away from our coast, and we don't like that. So we might have to jump in if we have to. All right, now the Spanish-American War was a military conflict between Spain and the United States. It began April 1898, and the hostilities ended with the Treaty of Paris in that same year. So 1898, April, all the way to December. Very, very short, quote-unquote, war. But it was a declared war. It was set up basically to free Spain and protect U.S. interests in the area and promote the U.S. as a world power in the Caribbean. All right, 5 big reasons for involvement. First, the USS Maine exploded in the port of Havana. That was a big deal. Yellow journalism, which we'll talk more about later. The Delome letter. U.S. jingoism / imperialism, because really they're two sides of the same coin at this point. And Spanish suppression of Cuban rebellion. So the Spaniards had basically been acting more and more like tyrants and basically mistreating the Cuban population, and they were very aware of it. And over time, the rebels were gaining more and more power and more population, and it was a matter of time before Spain got kicked out at some degree. All right, so the Imperialist Taylor. This is basically a political cartoon, and the idea that we're basically just slowly getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we got to keep changing the size of our suit. Well, the idea being that each one of these portions of the suit represents some other portion of U.S. foreign policy. So rational expansion being the idea that basically we're growing larger and larger for various reasons, whether you're justifying with social Darwinism, imperialism, Anglo-Saxon Eurocentrism, and how that culture is better. All those various ideas. Enlightenment is another use by the Taylor in this cartoon, basically showing that as we're expanding, we're kind of getting too big for our britches in a lot of ways. All right, so the next major issue we have to talk about is yellow journalism. So yellow journalism is essentially a new term for what amounts to what we would call today a sensational journalism, or maybe even like not quite tabloid journalism, but journalism that's designed not so much to inform as it is to just get the reader excited, angry, like evoke some kind of emotion. So we think modern day journalism is more about, hey, let's go ahead and inform people, or even maybe a little more lean to the side of let's get people kind of excited or entertain people. Back then, journalism was just a way sometimes just to get people angry, and this is a great example right here. So at this time period, we're yellow journalists, and we'll talk about some famous ones later on. We're essentially trying to promote the idea of war with Spain over Cuba. So this is a great example. This is obviously not a photograph taken. This is an artist's rendition of an event that they claim happened, where Spaniards, or people from Spain, were searching an American woman on a steamer. And notice they're searching her, and she's naked. So this whole idea that these Spaniards, they're violating our women, just anything just to get people riled up and angry. This was typical of yellow journalism during the time, this sensationalized journalism that wasn't always factually accurate. And and take a look at this is a great little cartoon about 2 very famous yellow journalists. So you got Pulitzer, and you got a man named Hearst. And if you ever heard of the Pulitzer Prize, it's named after the guy on the left. Now, this is a cartoon basically talking about how both these people are putting up this block set in creating war, because they're creating this sensationalized idea of what Spain is doing. And essentially it's basically these two people, William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer, they're both kind of pushing this war through their use of yellow journalism and sensational stories that aren't always factually accurate. Jingoism. This is a term used to describe the competitive feeling the nations had towards each other in the late 19th century and in early 20th centuries. Bigger part of this is it's a very strong sense of nationalism to the point that it's a very negative or almost like a bad thing. If you called someone a jingoist today, that'd be like calling them a racist almost. They're basically so pro their nation that they believe that many other nations are inferior, that especially the colonized nations, think places like the Philippines and Panama, those are the lesser people that we're trying to bring up. Again, the whole infantilizing of different races and different nationalities in this Anglo-Saxon Eurocentric mind point that everything that's Protestant, white, and English is better than all these other cultures. This is kind of that's all those things kind of mush together and make this concept of jingoism more pervasive during this time period. And here's one of the most famous yellow journalists out there, a guy named William Randolph Hearst. He was a very, 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 very wealthy man. He was a newspaper publisher and gained fame for his yellow journalism, very sensational stories during the Spanish-American War. And he actually is quoted as saying, "If you provide the pictures, I'll provide you the war." Basically saying, hey, if you give me some good pictures, I can get people riled up enough to where they're going to want to go to war. And he made a lot of money at it. As you can see on the right-hand side, that's his home, or it was his home when he was alive. I don't know if he hit the billionaire mark, but he probably was in that little sphere. He's also credited with a lot of the anti-marijuana laws that happened during this time period. He was instrumental in being anti-marijuana, in part because he actually was a big owner of timber. So he had a lot of land with a lot of woods for lumber. And hemp, which is part of a cannabis plant, was really just setting up to take over as a paper manufacturer. So he was going to lose a lot of money, so he kind of went off and said, marijuana is so terrible, yada, yada, yada. Like, he was influential with, movies like Reefer Madness and other various, what was anti-marijuana propaganda at the time. Just a little history side note, not relevant for this course. And this is Joseph Pulitzer. This is a competitor of Hearst, and he seized on war stories, and he also promoted yellow journalism. So you have two competitors competing to do better at the same thing, which is basically promote an emotional war with Spain using yellow journalism and sensational stories. So they were kind of building on top of each other and making the situation worse and worse and worse. All right, so 10,000 miles from tip to tip. So this is a cartoon of the time, basically just showing this is that whole sphere of influence idea. We're going from Puerto Rico all the way to Manila, all the way to Hawaii, all the way to Santo Domingo, all the way to these various other islands out in the Pacific. This idea that America is just becoming greater and larger, and this large, noble eagle is just protecting or spreading its wings out wide. Very jingoist, very nationalist, very imperialist. The Spanish-American War is also the first war of any consequence after the Civil War. So take a look at this picture. You see this little Cuban representation in the background who'd been freed from her chains. And you see on the right-hand side a Union general, and you see on the left-hand side a Confederate general shaking hands. The idea is that this picture represents reconciliation to free Cuba after the American Civil War. So basically they're saying, well, we were enemies, now we're back together to promote freedom for another people, in this case the Cubans. Joseph Wheeler. This is a kind of interesting story. So when the Spanish-American War happened, they needed a general to come in. Well, the guy that was perfect for the job was Joseph Wheeler. And the first thing he told everybody was, I'm not going to go do this. I'm too old. I can't be out there leading troops into battle. I'm old. Leave me alone. And then they were basically like, your country needs you. They appealed to that nationalism, that national pride, and boom, he's back in the war. And he's actually, supposedly, this is mixed accounts, and he may or may not have said this, he says, to hell with the Yankees while he's fighting Cubans. And he goes, damn it, I meant Spaniards. I meant the Spaniards. Because he was so used to saying to hell with the Yankees because he was a Confederate general. So there are some interesting stories during this time period about just reconciliation between old Southern officers and infantrymen that actually are now fighting for what is now officially the Union, the entire country united. So there is some funny stories about various issues happening during this time period. But this was a reconciliation kind of war where the North and South kind of mushed back together and said, okay, we're not separate anymore. They buried the hatchet in a lot of respects post-Reconstruction. All right, the Delhomme letter, or Delhomme, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what's in it. All right, basically, it criticized McKinley as a weak letter. It was sent from Spain's minister in the U.S. to an official in Cuba. So basically, there's a guy, we have an ambassador in the U.S. from Spain who's talking crap about our president. That's what's going on. And it said, quote, weak and catering to the rabble, and besides a low politician who desires to leave a door open to me and to stand well within the jingos of his party. So basically, he's calling him a two-faced weakling, is what he's calling our president. Did not go over well with the yellow journalism or anything else. Trip, go watch TV, okay? Go watch TV. Go talk to Mommy. Mommy will help you. Now here's the thing. This letter was later published in the New York Journal. So not only, it's not like this got kept secret. So now the entire country knows, oh, so Spain's talking crap about our guy. Guess what? This led to more and more war feelings. This is February 9th, 1898. And some big stuff's about to happen. The war starts in April of 1898. So we're right on the cusp of this all going down. Now, President McKinley, he was kind of that middle-of-the-road guy. He wanted to fight off the warmongers, people who wanted to go to war, and basically say, hey, if there's war, it might cost us a lot of money in the long run. So McKinley was always trying to stop the war from happening, but eventually popular pressure, he just has to go with it. All right, so the USS Maine. This is considered the primary catalyst that actually really got us into the war. Like, when this happened, I was like, all right, we're at war now. We're done. This is ridiculous. Now, they consider this the immediate cause. I don't know, you just walked to me. So the USS Maine was in a Havana harbor. Havana is a little port city in Cuba. Now the USS Maine then exploded, and they blamed the Spanish. Now there's been later evidence saying that the reason it exploded had nothing to do with, they thought it might be a mine or a bomb being blown up, something like that. But what we now think it might have been was the USS Maine blowing up because powder was kept in inappropriate conditions, and they basically got too hot and it exploded that way. But it still ended up killing 260 sailors. And again, because of yellow journalism, this whole idea of propaganda from this war, they had a lot of ammo to work with. Whether or not the USS Maine blew up because of the Spanish, or because of rebels, or because of just how the gunpowder was kept. And here's some propaganda from the time. Sailors of the Maine being killed by these Spanish brutes. Again, a little racist there. Remember the Maine, the hell with Spain. That was a battle cry during this time period, basically to promote the war. And here's an actual picture of the USS Maine before it exploded. And there's an artist's rendition. Again, this is yellow journalism. There's no evidence that it looked like this, with smokestacks flying in the air and it being horribly violent. You see what appears to be men being blown in the sky. There's no evidence that took place, but this is what ended up in newspapers, and this is what riled up the population and got people wanting to go to war with Spain and Cuba. They even issued a reward saying for anybody who can find the perpetrator who blew it up. There was diagrams showing that how they think they destroyed the Maine with a mine, even though later on there's no evidence that actually happened. All this yellow journalism, this is New York Journal, a big newspaper at the time, pushing this whole agenda of the Maine was blown up by Spain and they need to pay for it. Let's go to war. All that was being pushed by these yellow journalists like William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer. Now here's an actual picture of the Maine after the fact. Now, we don't know what it looked like when it blew up, but obviously the ship's horribly mangled, and this is why 260 sailors died in the ship, because it was a bad explosion. We just don't know how bad it was. Now, at this point, war is going to happen. So Congress makes a rule called the Teller Amendment, basically saying that we're going to go to war with Spain, but as a condition of that, we're going to promise not to annex Cuba, or basically take over Cuba afterwards. We're not going to make Cuba part of the United States. So this is a way to let the Cubans have their independence, put some big air quotes around that, because we'll get to that later about how little independence they actually end up having. But officially, they are considered an independent country, and we're not allowed to take them over after that we've gotten rid of the Spanish. All right, so now let's talk real fast about Commodore George Dewey. So he's the American naval commander who seized control of the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. So you got the Spanish-American War theater in Cuba, and then you also have it in the Philippines. Now they're terribly different. So the Spanish-American conflict in Cuba was looked at much more positively, even historically to a certain extent, whereas the war in the Philippines was just looked at terribly. Like the war stories from the Philippines are just awful, and it's not like the Filipino people treating us badly. It's often us treating the U.S. soldiers and everybody else treating the Filipinos very badly. It was a bloody, nasty war in this time period. It was not. There was no pro-U.S. side in the Philippines that had any real power. Whereas in Cuba, you had the rebels who didn't like Spanish rule. They were out there fighting with us, trying to make things happen. that really wasn't happening in the Philippines nearly as much. So it was a much nastier thing. We were more like occupiers in the Philippines, unfortunately, and it was just an example. Like where if you could call the Spanish American theater in Cuba a positive imperialistic war, then definitely the Spanish American theater in the Philippines would be the negative side of imperialism. Some people say they're both negative, but whatever. The bottom line is they're two very different theaters in the same war, and they're perceived differently. Historically, they're looked upon very differently, just because how we treated the Filipino people versus how we treated the Cuban people is terribly different. All right, so pause this, take a second to actually do the assignment that's located in there, and turn it on a separate sheet of paper. All right, so we cannot talk about imperialism, the Spanish-American War, without talking about Teddy Roosevelt. So we talked about Roosevelt a little bit with the Industrial Revolution and his presidency as a progressive movement kind of person, antitrust, anti-monopoly kind of guy. Well, he got his start as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in McKinley's administration. So the first time McKinley got elected, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, he was a very, very much an imperialist, an American nationalist, and you cannot deny the man was brave, because the stuff about San Juan Hill with like multiple accounts that it's all true, he did some crazy brave stuff out there. So you can't call him a coward, but you can definitely call him an imperialist and definitely an American nationalist. Now, he criticized McKinley for, quote, having the backbone of a chocolate eclair. Remember, McKinley was very anti-war. He was trying to avoid war. Theodore Roosevelt was like, yeah, war's good. War proves your mettle. That's how you prove you're a good country, is when you go to war. That's how you make yourself a tough young man. You go to war. You're a veteran. That's part of the American experience. That's kind of how Theodore Roosevelt looked at war, as far as the value of it. It's a very strange concept, the value of war. But that's how Roosevelt kind of looked at it. He resigned his position. It's like a cushy job in D.C., making good money. He's from a very wealthy family. He doesn't have to go to war. He resigns just so he can go fight in Cuba. Like, he resigns from this cushy job just to go off and be like, yeah, I'm going to go fight people because that makes me tougher. Very, very strange position. So this very famous picture, there was keep in mind, Roosevelt came from a wealthy family. He actually hired the very famous tailor nowadays. I forget their names. It's Brooks Brothers. He hired them to tailor out a suit for him and make him look like a frontiersman. Like, he was not a frontiersman. He was from a wealthy family in New England. Well, he became the leader of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, and he became a national hero as a result. He led a famous charge up Kettle Hill and later became a progressive and imperialist president. But he was one of these guys that was all about, American value and American mettle. It's all proven in warfare. He thought that in general, any cultured society was you prove yourself through warfare, conquering other people, and that is part of being a great power in the world. That's just how Roosevelt looked at things. And here's some Rough Riders cavalrymen, and it was an integrated force. You can see from the pictures this white and black soldiers are both involved. Secretary John Hay actually referred to the Spanish-American War as the Splendid Little War. And it was splendid partly because we won very easily. It was not a difficult process. The casualty rate among the natives of the Philippines was much higher than it was among U.S. troops. So it was a low casualty rate, high infliction of damage to the other side, and it was fast. It was over in less than a year, so that's why he calls it the Splendid Little War. Now, there's also the Anti-Imperialist League. Mark Twain was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League, so Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, all those various wonderful satirist writings that he did, he was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. Now, the League was against the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1898 because they felt that it went against the principles of freedom for the Filipinos. The Filipino people were kind of getting the shaft in that deal, and didn't like it. They thought it would increase the number of cheap workers and possibly add peoples that could pollute our stock. In that context, talking about white folks. So there's this anti-imperialist side of it, but there's also kind of a racist side of the Anti-Imperialist League. Very strange that they're progressive because they want to promote freedom for Filipinos, but they're also regressive because they're like, yeah, we don't want them mixing with our white people. Very negative and very positive at the same time. Very interesting group of people in history. Just they're anti-imperialist, so they're progressive, but they're also regressive in how they look at race and how they look at different cultures and how they interact. And this would be a anti-imperialist cartoon. So you're talking about, well, Congress is going to pass this treaty and everything, but then we're going to have to deal with these savages. So they were very racist in how they viewed other cultures. They referred to them as savages sometimes. All right, the Treaty of Paris in 1898, and there's a bunch of treaties of Paris, because for some reason every time you go to war with somebody, Paris is the location where they negotiate the treaty. And that's why you have so many treaties of Parises. All right, so the treaty ended the Spanish-American War. The U.S. won and received from Spain territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And it provided for future Cuban independence. Remember that whole the amendment we talked about earlier that made it so that we could not annex Cuba? Well, that's why they're independent, because otherwise we might have just won the island of Cuba along with all those other islands as well. All right, here's the big points of the Treaty of Paris. Cuba was freed from Spanish rule. Spain gave up Puerto Rico and the island of Guam. And the U.S. paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines, which would be like, it's a pittance. I mean, it's no money for considering how valuable those islands are strategically. So it was a very good deal on our end. And the U.S. became an imperial power. So at this point, we have lots of land across the globe, which makes us more imperial, more colonial, and gives us more advantages on the world stage. So circled in red, you see the Philippines and Guam. And then over to the other, inside that box, see Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Panama Canal. All areas that we are now in control of after the Spanish-American War. All right, so here's the U.S. deaths. So as far as the number of soldiers that died, and the numbers do vary a bit, as far as, and these are just deaths, not casualty rates. Remember, a casualty means they're not able to fight anymore. So you can not die and still be considered a casualty, someone who's been wounded. So you're looking at 2,400 or so people died. 385 of them died in battle. The rest all died of food poisoning and disease. So this is a very one-sided fight we're talking about here. We lost 385 people to fighting, as opposed to, I think, just the Filipino cause. They lost 40,000 people dead. All right, then we have the Platt Amendment. This amendment was basically forced Cuba. It was an amendment that Cuba signed, but kind of by force. Basically, it gave Cuba some, we call them protectorate qualities, but essentially it meant that the U.S. had control indirectly of Cuba. So was there Cuban independence? The Teller Amendment, 1898. The Platt Amendment, 1903. Cuba was not to enter any agreements with foreign powers that would endanger its independence. So basically, Cuba wasn't allowed to, let's say one day, say, well, you know what, Cuba's doing pretty badly. Let's go back and join Spain again. They wouldn't be allowed to do that. So anything, the Cubans didn't have full control over their own destiny as a result of these amendments. The U.S. could intervene in Cuban affairs if it was necessary to maintain an efficient and independent government. So if we didn't think Cuba was doing a good enough job, we could jump in there and do our own thing again. So again, they didn't really have much control. And Cuba must lease Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. for a naval coaling station, basically where they refuel naval ships at the time that were run on coal and steam. So again, they're losing their ability to engage in diplomacy. If they don't do a good job, we could run there and take over again. And Cuba had to lease land to the U.S., very valuable land to the U.S. So again, does this look like Cuban independence, or does it look like indirect control? And then finally, Cuba must not build up an excessive public debt. So basically, they can't borrow money the way they want to, unless we agree to it. All right, so there's Guantanamo Bay. It's on the eastern side of Cuba, and it's very famous nowadays for various reasons, because that's where we keep terrorist suspects. This is a Caribbean map if you want to look at that. All right, now let's talk about the Philippines. So this area was eventually annexed by the Treaty of Paris in 1898. However, there were lots of Filipino natives that weren't too keen on Americans coming in and taking over. So there was the Philippine War from 1899 to 1902. 20,000 Filipinos were killed, 4,000 Americans were killed. This is the nasty war. This is the one I was talking about earlier, where we're fighting over in the Philippines, and there's horrible war stories about just torture and just like destroying bodies. And it became a nasty thing where the Filipinos would capture American soldiers and do something terrible to them and kill them. And then the U.S. soldiers would get those same guys and capture them and then kill them in an even worse way. And this is a time period when they used to censor mail. So every now and then you get some letters coming back home that just say the most terrible things that were happening during this war. This would be like the tail end of American nationalism, because this war was not full of national pride. This was a native people being taken over by a European power, being the U.S. in this case. It was a nasty war, and to this day in the Philippines, like, there's still like a lot of resentment, especially to colonial powers in the U.S. and Spain, about how they were treated. And it's a very dark spot on U.S. history that's not given very much attention. This is just a picture of some of the Filipino casualties from the first day of the war. I mean, this was a circular trench, and the headline was "The Insurgent Dead." An insurgent is somebody that's native to the population that's fighting you. So, like the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, they were insurgents. The ISIS, in some ways, is an insurgent group. That are fighting the people who have occupied the country, being the U.S. and the Iraqi government. So it was very, very one-sided, and it's just this picture right here is just a very small portion of the casualty rate, and it was a nasty, nasty war. All right, so now we're on to the issue of, well, we've been doing some various things with war and death and all that fun stuff, and now let's talk about the politics of it, because that's super fun. So you have McKinley on the left-hand side there, and his vice presidential candidate, FDR. So if you look at this little it's not really a cartoon, but it is a cartoon. On the left-hand side, you're talking about all the promises. These are all the problems in Cuba that were there. And now because you elected the McKinley administration, look at how great things are going in 1900. This is great. There's now factories and work happening in Cuba. There's progressivism. There's people at the bank. American rule in Cuba looks much better than Spanish rule in Cuba. Look how great Americans are, and look how great McKinley is. You should elect him. That's the idea of this basic ad. Now, Roosevelt became president when William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist named Leon, because I can't pronounce that name. There's too many Z's and stuff in there, in Buffalo, New York. McKinley was shot on the 6th of September. He died a few days later on the 14th. And at that point, Teddy Roosevelt took over. All right, so William McKinley was assassinated by a guy named Leon Czolgosz, Czolgosz, however you want to pronounce it. Said he killed the president because he was the enemy of the working people. And there's a artist rendition of what happened. There was big conflict happening at the time, and again, this is a time period when there is no Secret Service protecting the president, so killing a president, sadly, was kind of easy. All right, so now the Roosevelt corollary. All right, so in a statement in 1904, it basically expanded on that old thing we used to call the Monroe Doctrine, meaning that under James Monroe, they came up with a doctrine saying that the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean is the U.S. sphere of influence. Well, this takes a step further and says Latin America and the Caribbean, if there's any trouble with them paying debts, then basically the U.S. can jump in to intervene. So basically, we used to be, okay, well, if there's someone who's taking over and destroying their independence, we can intervene. So if, like, Spain came in to attack Cuba again, we would defend Cuba. Well, now it's if Cuba can't pay back their debts, now we can intervene as well. So basically, and we call this big stick diplomacy. So normally, if someone was just taking on too much debt and being a bad country, you'd do sanctions, you do diplomacy. This is, hey, we're going to shoot you if you don't pay back your debts the way you're supposed to. Kind of a harsh way to deal with countries that are poor, not being able to pay back their debts. So here it is. So the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, is the title of this little cartoon, basically saying that, hey, the North America and South America, that's the U.S. The Monroe Doctrine says that's all ours, and everybody else over there in Europe can just deal with it. Sorry, guys, that's your province, not ours. So we get this half of the globe, you get that half. We win. All right, so take a look at this quote and take a look at that cartoon. Chronic wrongdoing may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to exercise of an international police power. So basically, this is where that term, the U.S. as the world's policeman, this is where that kind of starts out, is with Teddy Roosevelt saying, we're going to protect this whole area from wrongdoing by others interfering, or because people who are in control of these countries do wrongdoing themselves, like going into massive debt or oppressing their people. So it basically gives the U.S., quote-unquote, the authority to be the policeman for that portion of the world. Pause it here, complete the assignment and the questions that are on there, and turn them in on a separate sheet of paper. There's a better map of it if you need it. All right, so big stick policy. President Theodore Roosevelt policy stated in the Roosevelt corollary. That's all it is. So speak softly but carry a big stick is a very famous quote by Teddy Roosevelt. It's all based on this idea that if other countries try to interfere, we can come in and fight. But now, if these countries in the Western Hemisphere, in our hemisphere, if they start to do things like not protect their country or go into massive amounts of debt, now we can intervene again. So take a look at it. You see the ships here. You see Teddy Roosevelt with his big stick walking around. And you see the battleships. And one says debt collection. You see Mexico, Santo Domingo, all these other Latin American countries, Panama. Well, now they're the new debt collector. And then you see the constable of the world's constable, Teddy Roosevelt being the policeman of the world, basically going through and saying, hey, if you don't do things right, we'll come in and we'll make you do them right. Very negative view of Teddy Roosevelt.